Alright, welcome back to this place where we're going to talk about that thing. So we have an essay due next week, and I want to check in, see how you're doing on the essay. And I also want to have this as a bit of a teachable moment so we can highlight some things, some concerns that I might have moving forward about essays after reading a bunch of really bad essays on the weekend from around the province. So if you want, you can join me on Google Classroom where the assignment is listed. If you want, you might want to take some notes. In this document, I've already taken some notes, so you could always make a copy of the document and make your own notes with it. That might be to your benefit. But what I'd like to do is go through the analysis with you again and talk about the body a little bit so that we can see some greater purpose in what we're going to be learning about later today, and so that we can begin to really piece some of the lessons that we've seen recently together. So the first thing to do when you get your diploma exam in June, and more importantly when you get my midterm in May, which is worth more, is read the question. So here the question reads, a passive and ignorant citizenry will never be a viable cornerstone for a functional democratic society. In order to progress, we need to address the flaws of democracy. You know, when in doubt, when it's a source like an A2 or some of the A1s and it's all about language, when in doubt, break the language down. You know, that is a great step to do, right? So we're going to try to identify key terms. So I've done that here in different colors. I'm like, one key concept is this idea of passive and ignorant citizenry. So I want to make sure I talk about that. Another key concept is this will never be a viable cornerstone. So I'm going to talk about that. Another key concept, functional democratic society, the concept of progress, and then finally address the flaws of democracy. So when I look at the source, that's what I pull from it. Now, this is not an old diploma exam question, but it's written in the same language as all those diploma exam questions, right? As you can see, when you looked at maybe that term project at the end of the year that has a list of all the essay questions that have ever been asked, all the A2s ever been asked, they typically are in this idea. There's a problem and a solution. It's two sentences. Some of them are one sentence. Some of them don't quite fit the same model, but most do. Any questions about what I've highlighted? Any concern that you wouldn't have highlighted the same stuff? Can we agree that these are the quote-unquote big rocks? This is what the source is about. So in order to analyze it, we have to break down those big rocks. So I would suggest to you that the goal is this, really try to have the same color. The goal is this functional democratic society. A passive and ignorant citizenry will never be a viable cornerstone for a functional democratic society. Now, they don't explicitly state that is the goal, but we can infer that it's being implied. It's not explicitly stated that that's our goal here, but we can infer that it's being implied to us, that the goal is a functional democratic society. So I take that term, that phrase, and somewhere in my analysis early on, I might break this down. That the phrase functional democratic society is presented as, you know, maybe an implicit goal. Yet the source does little to define what that means. We can infer that the source would be, in favor of or would promote active and informed citizens as a possible, you know, method to achieve that goal. Yet the source offers no clear path to achieve that. So we can infer that the source would promote active and informed citizens as a possible method to achieve the goal. Yet the source offers no clear path to achieve active and informed citizens, right? That's kind of just a beginning, taking that phrase, functional democratic society, and identifying it as a implicit goal. And really identifying what the theme of this paper is going to be. Next up, in red, we have passive and ignorant citizenry. This is presented as a possible obstacle, right? So before we get there, why should overcoming passivity and ignorance be important to defending democracy is something that you could ask. To unpack the source, you could ask a question. Asking a question gives you an opportunity to answer the question and therefore unpack the source. So why should overcoming passivity and ignorance be important to defending democracy? The authority and legitimacy of liberal democracy resides with the people. If the people are uninterested or incapable of expressing their will, then the policies created by the government may not reflect the will of the people, and democracy could be lost. And, as a result, democracy could be lost. So what I've done here is I've stated the goal, but now I'm trying to connect it to the obstacle. And in order to make that bridge to connect it to the obstacle, I asked a hypothetical question. So sometimes asking a hypothetical question can give you an opportunity to further analyze the source. There's my hypothetical question. Do you guys see how I added that step here? So I identified the goal. The goal is presented. Functional democratic society is presented as the implicit goal, yet the source does little to define what that means. We can infer that the source would promote active and informed citizens as a possible method to achieve the goal, yet the source offers no clear path to achieve active and informed citizens. So we're talking about that, and then I'm going to segue towards my obstacle. Why should overcoming passivity and ignorance be important to defending democracy? And then I answer that, and by doing so I answer it from the perspective of the source. Now I can get to the obstacle, and I can look at the complexity of the obstacle. Passive and ignorant citizens. What does a passive citizen look like? So I'm going to be very specific and just look at the passive part. Who defines what passive looks like, right? In order to analyze the source, we must ask the question, who is defining what passive citizens look like? The role of an active citizen under an authoritarian leader like Hitler is much different than what would be expected under a liberal democracy, a liberal democratic leader like Justin Trudeau. Do we even want citizens to be active? Hobbes surely would not, because he believes by nature we're emotional, we're irrational, we're violent, we're selfish. His goal is not to encourage active citizens, it's actually to do the opposite, to control citizens' behavior. So the next question I'm asking is, why are they passive anyways? Is it the nature of citizens that make them passive? Is it a symptom of a failed system that has placed the citizens at a distance from decision making, and that's why they're passive? Or is their passivity a sign that citizens are passive because they don't need to be active? They don't need to be active because their state is functioning as they want it. Sometimes passivity might be a sign or symptom of a healthy society. Well, no one cares to vote because we're not really concerned about the outcome of the election. The issues aren't that grave to us. The candidates aren't that extremely different. We're comfortable with any of the candidates. We're comfortable with all the major political parties. So the idea that people aren't voting or that people aren't engaged in politics, maybe that's a sign or a symptom of a healthy democracy. People are happy. They're content. They don't need change. So they're not looking to create radical change at the ballot box. Next up, I break down the word ignorance by, again, asking a question. What is our expectation surrounding ignorance? Is it reasonable to expect citizens to be experts on all the nuances of modern governance? Should we be expected to be informed about all domestic and foreign issues? If so, how do we gain that information? Through private or public media? If we can conclude that the state should educate citizens out of ignorance, that could become dystopian, like in Orwell's 1984. Finally, what if some are incapable of escaping ignorance? Should we disenfranchise them by adding a competence requirement to citizenship? If so, is that not going to destroy the democratic system that the source is suggesting it wants to save? So what I'm doing there with the idea of ignorance, I'm asking a series of hypothetical questions to unravel the perspective in front of me. Any questions about what I did with the term ignorance or what I did with the term passive? Now we can talk about tone. Added to the perspective shown here is a clear tone. The source uses absolute language like never in order to present a tone, maybe present an alarmist or an urgent tone. This is never going to work. It's an absolutist term, right? It is worth noting that ignorant citizens might be seen as a viable cornerstone for a different system, and we talked about this when I first put the essay in there. During the feudal order, most individuals had little knowledge of the issues of governance, nor did they want to attain it. More recent authoritarian states such as fascist Germany and under Hitler and communist Soviet Union under Stalin not only excluded the majority from political participation, from maybe meaningful, because they did get to vote, but they also used dictatorial tools like indoctrination and propaganda to manufacture a reality that legitimized their control. So, what have I done there? I've taken the word never and I've unraveled the tone there, and I added the idea that, you're talking about never will be a viable cornerstone for a democracy, but ignorant citizens, that's great under fascist or communist states. So then the heart of the matter is the solution. We must address the flaws of democracy. So obviously the perspective that democracy is flawed is subjective. And therefore it is significant to note that due to our individual ideologies, our bias, our experiences, our worldviews, our values, our relationship to each other, our relationship to our land, our religion, all of these things, maybe our occupation, our education, we may disagree on what these flaws are and to what extent should they be reformed, or whether we need to replace the system entirely. And then we need to really respond to this essay, we need to understand what are the flaws. So today's lesson is looking at accountability or lack of accountability within democracy. And the lack of accountability would be a flaw. If democracy is legitimate because of accountability, then we better ensure that the system isn't designed to take away accountability. So what is the ultimate goal? The ultimate goal is progress. So we had a goal that we had up here, right? The goal up here was functional democratic society, but the ultimate goal is progress. So again, it's like the whole idea of the full potential phrase that's in some essays. A word like progress or full potential or strengthen or weaken, all of these words are very subjective, right? They're very vague, open to discussion, open to debate. What is progress? Is it economic progress that Smith wrote of? That is only possible at the end of our selfishness and by promoting economic individualism and economic private property and economic freedom? Or is progress the contrasting social and economic evolution towards classlessness that Marx had envisioned? What is progress socially and economically? And potentially, does one of those concepts get in the way of democracy? Is a permanent, and I don't know why that's not spell checked there, is permanent progress even viable? Do we have ecological and environmental limits to our economic capability? That's from Social 10.1, right? The idea is this viable? Is this paradigm sustainable? Or are we in that metaphorical, as Ray Anderson said, metaphorical plane crash? We're running out of energy. We're running out of resources. In light of recent years of great social unrest, in terms of social issues, it would be very difficult to reach any consensus as to what extent something is progress. Is the redefinition of genders progress. Not to the opinion of many conservative people it isn't. Is the redefinition of marriage progress? Not to the definition of many traditionalists it isn't. So that's where the idea of social progress is very controversial. For the sake of the source, we can infer that they, the voice behind the source, would define progress as. So we're going to need to complete that to complete the analysis. So, in order to complete the analysis, we have to figure out what might somebody who promotes democracy view as progress. In order to complete the analysis, we have to identify what are the flaws of democracy. And then building a body, here's the thesis statement. Here's the same thesis statement with the more familiar although, but, therefore. So, democracy's goal, worth working towards. In order to strengthen democracy, we have to identify the flaws and then overcome them. Pretty simple body now, right? Democracy is better than dictatorship. Democracy does have flaws, though. Here's how we fix them. Very logical. Very logical. So ideas for the body: a passive and ignorant citizenry. There's the essay prompt again. Paragraph 1: democracy is a goal worth working towards. Discuss how life under authoritarian regimes, not great. We don't like indoctrination. We don't like propaganda. We don't like scapegoating. We don't like purges and force and terror and intimidation. And I think that's an easy part of that paragraph to talk about. And the second part of that paragraph: life under a democracy leads to more self-actualization and happiness and fulfillment. So you could throw in some Maslow and some stuff like that. And then second paragraph: these are the flaws of democracy. And then third: this is how we fix them. So I think in order to come up with a clear list of this, next step for us, take a look at lesson 25. So I'm going to get you to do some work with that. I'm going to get you to read through. And at the end of this lesson, I want you to understand, what does accountability mean? That's often a pillar of these essays. And then, to what extent has accountability been compromised in Canada and the US? So there's lots of links here for you to kind of look into it in more detail. Skim through Jefferson's quote. If you try to read it and spend 10 minutes on this, you're never going to get the lesson done. So maybe spend 3 minutes skimming it. Skim through this idea that the deep state in the US holds the government accountable. But again, that's subject to your viewpoint. The deep state would be the swamp that Trump tried to go in and drain. The idea that there's unelected government bureaucrats that have the ability to undermine the vision of the president. That sounds undemocratic. Government workers are undermining the elected officials. So that'd be like me as a government worker in the Department of Education, delivering education, to say, okay, here's the new curriculum my government says I must teach. And I'm like, you know what? That stuff's garbage. I'm going to teach whatever I want. Today we're going to learn why Superman doesn't take over the world. Because that's more important. As I destroy my keyboard. Then I want you to consider the idea of election results and apathy. A passive, one way to observe or quantify passivity is to observe apathy, right? Apathy is the manifestation, right? So how do we measure apathy? Election results are the easiest way. So we can look at election trends to see, do we have more or less apathy? When do people vote? When do they not vote? And who's not voting? How can we get people to care? Now this cartoon is suggesting that when Harper was Prime Minister, he didn't want us to care. It was easier for him to be Prime Minister if we just left him alone. And in hindsight, it might have been easier for Canada if we had just left him alone. Here's some voter turnout results among different demographics. So you can see here that as people get older, they become more engaged in politics. So one of the flaws politically might be to overcome this youth apathy. But what you're seeing here is a lot more youth voted in 2015, hence Trudeau winning the election. So all you have to do is play on simple solutions like, I'm going to legalize marijuana for you. Or the budget will balance itself. Or I promise electoral reform. He did one of those three things. Probably not the one he needed to. So then there's some notes for you to read through. Some documents. This one is a dead link. No figure that the government has censored this idea that they paid someone to write an article about climate change to help support their platform, their party platform on climate change. So yes, take some time to read through these things. Lots of scandals in Alberta and Canada's history. And there's a link here to the other concept we'll look at today is the media. The media's job to be a whistle dog, right? Or a whistleblower, to be a watchdog. Whistle dog, that sounds like a really bad A&W thing. So the media is meant to be a watchdog, right? Blow the whistle of concern when the government is corrupt. And we're seeing lots of evidence of corruption at the provincial and federal levels. So how do we deal with it? How do we restore ethics to government? Here's some concerns or some solutions presented by the Conservatives, but not enough people believed in it to change the government. And then there's a whole list of scandals in our history, and even the Conservatives have been guilty of some scandals. So maybe we need more accountability acts, and we need more ombudsmen and watchdogs and stuff like that. All right, so I'm going to give you about 20 to 25 minutes to work through lesson 25, and then we're going to talk about lesson 25 and the media lesson you guys looked at earlier in the week.